Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Understanding the 2025-26 Apprenticeship Funding Rules with our guest speaker, David Lockhart-Hawkins. My name's Nadine and I'll be keeping things running in the background. While we wait for everyone to log in, I'll just quickly summarise the usual webinar rules. We will be recording the session and sending a copy to Aptum customers who have registered. All other attendees will be sent a summary slide deck. You're all muted for the duration of the session, so if you do need assistance during the webinar, please use the questions function in the top right-hand panel. With so many of you registered for today's session, we're unlikely to be able to respond to all questions during this webinar, but we will, however, aim to address common themes, so please do submit questions as we go through using the questions function. Next slide, please. I'll now introduce our guest speaker, David Lockhart-Hawkins, who many of you will already know as a leading voice in the sector relating to all things compliance. As Managing Director of Lockhart-Hawkins, David's portfolio includes some of England's best-known and high-performing universities, colleges, training providers, and employer providers. He has played a significant role in assisting the growth and prosperity of providers through DFE audit preparation, apprenticeship program design, quality improvement, and new provider support. David is also a Strategic Associate at the Strategic Development Network. We are also joined by Aptum Product Owner Martin Wood and Implementation Consultant Angela Metcalf, who will be on hand to pick up the questions related to the Aptum platform. I will now hand over to you, David, to take us through the 2025-26 funding rules.
Thank you, Nadine. Yeah, thank you ever so much to the team at Aptum for having me on today. A very warm welcome to you this afternoon. Thank you all for attending on the afternoon of Monday, the 2nd of June. I'm presenting for you today in partnership with the Strategic Development Network. Just a little bit about them on screen. They are my partner for CPD delivery. They work broadly in all facets of provider improvement and deliver a range of solutions in CPD, consultancy and advisory services, including as a partner of the Department for Education's Apprenticeship Workforce Development Programme. And they've supported a lot of providers, as you can see from the slide there. Okay, what are we all here for today? Well, this is a session to understand some of the key changes to the Apprenticeship Funding Rules that will apply from the 1st of August to new starts from the 1st of August. And my approach to these changes events makes a few assumptions. And the first is that you have a good understanding of the previous year's rules. Secondly, that you'll be able to take the knowledge you'll gain from today and practically implement it within your organization. We have an action-packed session today. We're going to look at those headline changes and start preparing for implementation. And many of you will have already started that journey. The objectives of today are to understand the impact and implications of the key changes, plan some initial actions, and establish a firm foundation for change implementation. For now, think about the principles of change management. What are the areas of change? Consider the risks strategically and operational to what you need to change and how you need to change it, whether that's going to be process, documents, program design, or accountability within an organization. It'll allow you to set priorities and make sure whatever you do, you work with all stakeholders across your organization and communicate what you're going to do. And as I said, the rules apply for new starts from August 2025. Otherwise, the rules that apply will be the rules from the year of a learner's start. That's very important. So what are our sources? Well, we have the funding rules documents, the full rules, a shortened summary of changes as well. I always recommend you don't just rely on the summary of changes document, as the devil is always in the detail. Equally, don't rely on a ChatGPT analysis of the full rules, because it's really important to go through the document and understand the minutiae there and understand what needs to be happening to be compliant and safeguard your funding. We also have this year, and we'll talk about it in a moment, a list of the off-the-job minimum hours for each of the standards that are out there. We'll talk about that a little later, but that's a very important thing that you will want to have access to after today. We also have updates to the ILR specification and the appendices on there, including an updated ILR privacy notice and some amendments to some of the fields within that. Nothing too significant in that area. We're also going to touch upon some changes to your funding agreements if you are a university, an ITP, or an employer provider. And we're also going to mention some changes to the not in education or training guidance that applies to apprenticeship programs in 25-26, actually applies has applied for a long time, but it's the first time that's mentioned in the funding rules for some time. We'll come to that in a moment. Okay, so what is changing in the apprentice journey? And those of you who have been on my webinars before might have seen this diagram. This is the stages of the apprentice journey. It puts them into a sequence. I call these 4 phases on the left-hand side: pre-entry, entry, delivery, and progression. The orange cells indicate the start of funding and usually the end of funding unless a learner withdraws before the end of the program. Now, not every provider will do the pre-entry phase the same, but from step 5 onwards, that's the last thing on the top row, most providers would be operating a process flow that's kind of in that order. And certainly, establishing where we are, what that apprenticeship looks like before we start that program and start getting funding for it. Now, just to put it into context as to what has changed for starts in 25-26, well, this kind of summarizes it. The orange areas show those affected by change, and in red are those areas significantly affected by change. And you can see it's quite a lot. The 25-26 rules represent the most significant changes to apprenticeship delivery and compliance since 2017 and have the potential to dramatically change a provider's product offer. I'm going to talk about each of these core changes in a moment, but what I can say now is that new rules on off-the-job hours, new rules on minimum duration, and the flexibility now to deliver off-the-job hours over any duration you like, as long as it's more than 8 months of practical training period, open up some new opportunities for models of delivery. Last week, we had the decision to restrict level 7 starts from January 2026 onwards to those aged 21 and under. That will close some avenues and opportunities, but there are some opportunities in this year's rules. I think as such, employer engagement is a key area where there will be a number of changes as a result of the new rules, where the design of your product offer, design of your tools and templates that you use to capture agreements and contractual terms, those things will need to be updated alongside your marketing materials, what's on your websites, what's in your published promotional material when you're changing some of the design of these programs, the hours of these programs, the duration of these programs, to ensure that you're setting the right expectations. I think elsewhere, the new off-the-job minimums will affect how providers look at their initial assessment process and will place greater emphasis on accuracy as you're establishing the minimum floor for your program. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the number of hours to be an apprentice in terms of need of learning, in terms of eligibility, it's changed from 278 to 187 hours, which potentially makes a lot more learners eligible for apprenticeship programs. Critically, we also see changes in the endpoint assessment process, not just in the activities within individual standards, but the timing of agreeing endpoint assessment organizations or apprenticeship assessment organizations, as they will now be called. Okay, let's look into some of these changes in a little bit more depth. So first off, the level 7 funding decision made just last week. Excuse me. So in 24-25, level 7 apprenticeship standards were fundable without restrictions. From January 2026, funding for new starts will only be for individuals aged 16 to 21, or if they hold an educational health and care plan, 16 to 24, or 19 to 24, as it says on the screen there. We expect that EHCP element to be confirmed in version 2 of the funding rules. What that means is that those providers delivering level 7 programs have only the remainder of the year to start those learners aged older than that. It's likely to result in a bit of a rush to recruit and enroll those last cohorts, which is going to be positive for your immediate revenues, but providers will want to just be cautious and prepared for whether all of those learners are likely to remain on program until the end. It could cause you some potential additional risks of program failure and accountability framework risks in areas of withdrawal, QAR retention, so on and so forth. Short term, what to do in this area? Well, if you do rely on level 7 offers, or you were thinking of having level 7 offers, think about the impact of that on your forecasting of enrollments and funding values and remodel accordingly. Think about your strategic offer and your intent, and consider the commercially funded alternatives that you might have to put in place, in terms of other things that individuals could fund or employers could fund. And although it's unlikely to be a solution for many, just because the apprenticeship isn't funded by government doesn't mean you couldn't have an apprenticeship in that area. So you could deliver a level 7 apprenticeship to somebody aged over 21, but it would not be funded by government. So probably does affect the uptake of that, but it is an option. Next, we have changes to your funding agreements if you are a university employer provider or independent provider. In 24-25, if you were inadequate as a result of Ofsted inspection, in part or overall, resulted in quite a significant list of possible interventions by the Department for Education. Now, your contracts this year have got some significant changes in there, widening in the scope of what the department could do in the scope of those interventions. Now allowing a scenario where if you requires improvement in consecutive activities, it could result now in interventions, and that requires improvement overall or in part. Have a look at those clauses 13.3 and 13.4 in those agreements. You'll be asked to sign your funding agreement in due course, and it's going to have those terms in it. This does carry obviously a little bit more risk for organizations that are in a situation of requires improvement. And I think that the top piece of advice here would be make sure you invest in quality support and quality advice and put in place the appropriate infrastructure, because two requires improvements could be a problem. Keep an eye out for the new inspection framework confirmation, because those gradings will be described potentially differently, and there'll be new subgradings. Expect funding agreements to then be updated with those updates to those to that inspection approach. So just be aware of that. Ensure you've got somebody paying attention to that. SDN do have a lot of stuff going on in that space in partnership with MESMA. Do keep an eye on those things, but I'm sure APTEN will also keep their clients informed. Let's move on to some other stuff. Of course, the closure of the Education Skills Funding Agency and the movement to the Department for Education Skills England. There's actually been some movement on that today in terms of the announcements of Skills England. Lots of people posting they're now working for Skills England, and the updates to the website with some more of the stuff that used to be on the IFATE space and on the ESFA space. For your providers, it's really a case of just think about making sure if you've been using wording of ESFA or Education Skills Funding Agency in your templates or documents or marketing offers or websites, change it to Department for Education, and then you'll be fully compliant. I don't see this as being a particularly funding risk, but in terms of establishing the correct parties that are within those contracts, it is the Department for Education that should be referenced in here. Okay, let's move on to the things that actually are going to have a big impact this year and onwards. So endpoint assessment, we've been expecting some change in here since it was announced in February that there were going to be some changes to the assessment process. For 24-25, endpoint assessment is called endpoint assessment. EPA is conducted by a third party unless it's an integrated degree apprenticeship. Integrated degree apprenticeships can be conducted by the provider in terms of the endpoint assessment of those if they've been approved by the quality body for that standard. And if you were delivering non-integrated apprenticeships where you did need that third-party EPAO, you could agree that endpoint assessment organization up to 6 months ahead of your expected gateway date. For 25-26, there are some key changes upcoming, and these align with when the standards are being revised. So each apprenticeship standard since April is in the process of some form of revision where the assessment plans for those are being updated. A document on the right-hand side of the screen explains that. Basically, what we're going to have 25-26, when your new standard is updated, and you can start learners on your existing standards as it stands, but when the new standard comes out, we will need to be agreeing endpoint assessment organizations from day one. we'll be renaming endpoint assessment apprenticeship assessment. We won't have EPAOs, we'll have assessment organizations. Gateway to completion will replace the term gateway. And non-integrated apprenticeship standards will likely have, and most probably will have components that would be or could be delivered by the provider, subject to that standard's individual assessment plan. An assessment may take place on program rather than all happening at the end. So there will be some key changes occurring in here. And the key thing is, if that standard has been revised to this new assessment model, you will need to be agreeing a relationship with that assessment organization from start. That's going to be really important because, of course, they're going to be involved from day one. What does this mean? Well, Annex B in the funding rules has a lot on this in paragraphs 340 onwards. I think providers are going to be faced with the reality of looking at amending the design of their programs, including some elements of assessment, looking at their skill set within the organization and perhaps bringing in additional resources to provide that assessment where the standard requires it. I think there's potentially some risk with providers in the design of their curriculum having off-the-job hours in subject areas that have already been assessed. Well, they wouldn't count as off the job if the learner's already been assessed as being competent in those areas. But it's certainly something to think about. Don't expect these changes to result in significant decrease in the price of that endpoint or assessment process, because those organizations will now have the cost of EQA. They'll also have some earlier costs in terms of helping those providers set up. So I think you'll see an increase in registration fees being paid sooner into that program rather than payments for EPA being done at the end. So that's going to be something, a variable to think about, and will be dependent upon the standards that you deliver. Liaise with your employee group for your standard. Think about and understand what's going to be happening. Most apprenticeship standards that are in revision, the employer group knows what's going on. There'll be some form of draft of what that assessment plan looks like. Understand the standards you do, get in touch with those and understand what's coming down the line. When you do get confirmation, you're going to need to change your contract templates with employers for new starts to ensure these terms are clear. And my top piece of advice for any provider with EPA or assessment organization pricing is negotiate a price based on the year of start rather than the year of completion, so that you're not hit by those variable increases in price due to inflation. Okay, next really important one, a change in the minimum duration of practical period. Was 12 months in 24-25 and is now 8 months for a start in 25-26. This does not apply to existing learners. This is new starts from the 1st of August. A minimum practical period of 8 months. A program can be planned to be more than 8 months, and most of you will have programs that are planned to be more than 8 months, but an apprentice can complete as long as they've done at least 8 months and achieved the minimum hours for their program. More on that in a moment. This does change a lot of things. It means that providers can have shorter programs than before. The agency, the department has also removed the need for you to average a certain number of off-the-job hours per week. Basically, a provider can deliver the hours of their program in whatever duration they want, as long as it's more than 8 months of practical training period. So that's potentially very, very flexible. So few key changes here. Accelerated programs become possible, particularly if you identify prior learning effectively. But for many providers that rush to say, okay, well, let's shorten our programs, let's reduce that down, be very cautious. Quality should win out here. What is possible, what's achievable? There will be an increased risk of planned end date issues of learner in the accountability framework of providers going past those planned end dates for undisciplined curriculum delivery. We also expect to see some strategic compliance risks of gaming funding by shortening that duration, when the reality is that those programs would take longer. Expect a little bit more focus on those providers and being past planned end date. So understand those hours in your, my key advice, understand the hours necessary to develop occupational competence in your standards. Understand how that volume could be or should be distributed to that client group. and who you work with based on client demand and delivery capability, and liaise with your employers on the model that suits them. And think about the employer's the makeup of that employer in terms of their staff retention, in terms of their training time availability, and help that inform what your model might need to look like. We also have, as I said, changes in the off-the-job minimum volume. So in 24-25, off-the-job minimum was based on averaging at least 6 hours per week before statutory leave across the practical period that you applied. If you had a 52-week or 12-month program, the minimum off the job was 278 hours, increased for each week of practical period that you planned. An apprentice could complete if they'd met that minimum at the point in time they were ready for EPA, as long as that had been at least 12 months. So obviously we now have an 8-month rule for new starts from August, but critically, we have that ability of flexible duration in terms of you can deliver the hours over the time frame that you want, as long as it's at least 8 months of practical training period. But the new minimum amount to be an apprentice is 187 hours. So no longer 278, it's 187. The department refers to this as significant new knowledge, skills and behaviours, but you can equate that to that 187 number. An apprentice is able to complete early, as long as they've done at least 8 months and have met the published volume of hours for their standard, minus whatever hours have been identified as prior learning. That's the next thing I'm going to talk about. The reality here is 187 hours is the important new number. You can have a lot of recognition of prior learning, still need 187 hours and be eligible for an apprenticeship. So think about your programs. We have a published list now of the minimum hours for each standard. Some of your programs will be more than those hours, but some of your programs might be less than those hours. I'll show you this published list here. This list shows should really be the minimum hours in your curriculum. If your curriculum is more than this, then that's potentially very good. You'll have understood why you've got more hours in. But if your hours are less than this, then you have a problem. If you're less than these numbers, then you need to add hours to your program design. If you found that learners did not need those hours, needed less, that was the lower number is why the amount the learner actually needed, then the reality is you're going to have prior learning applying in for a start in 25-26. This new methodology sets a minimum floor for a program, but continues that flexibility that allows a provider to have more hours if their standard needs it. And my advice is most standards will need more than these minimums. You use your best practice here to understand that. The question for providers with less than published minimum is there strategic prior learning in their client group or program design which allowed them to have less delivery, or were they simply understating the off-the-job hours that actually occurs in that program? And understanding that is going to be critical. Most of these key changes in this year, you can see, are about program design and program distribution. And that's a lot of strategic focus for a provider in terms of policy, in terms of what we're selling, how it looks, how we put it into our platforms. So this is potentially a very positive thing in that providers have flexibility to deliver programs over the flexible duration. If an employer only wants 4 hours a week, they can have a 4-hour week program. You wouldn't deliver that 4-hour week program to an employer with really poor staff retention, but if they had really good staff retention, maybe that would work. So key advice in this area is, first off, and the most important thing to do this summer, is look at all of your curriculum designs and look against that minimum published list. So you understand where your programs are above or below that number. If you're significantly under the minimum, and it wasn't because of understated hours in a program plan, be prepared to add those hours in and ensure you're applying prior learning. Either that, you're going to have situations where you're going to be having magic hours appearing that learners haven't really done to try and hit a minimum number. Because the most important thing we'll come to in a moment is that when an apprentice that starts in 25-26 completes, they will need to have done the number of hours that that are in that minimum minus prior learning. So if you're saying there's no prior learning, they've got to hit that minimum number. So if your minimum number is 280 hours and that learner has no prior learning, they've got to do 280 hours. If you've got a minimum for that standard at 400 hours and you say there's no prior learning, they've got to do 400 hours. If a learner has prior learning, then that number drops. So you can start to see there's a lot of focus in that prior learning structure of a provider and how you conduct that initial assessment. So yeah, have a look at that advice there. I can tell you now, if you do have robust initial assessment, robust analysis of prior learning, it's good for you to apply prior learning. If your funding formula in here is very provider friendly, it's the same formula as before. Okay. I just briefly, this is the guidance, which basically saying you can deliver over the time frame that you want, as long as it's at least 8 months. That's completely up to you. Just wanted to this little graphic here is just a little model of my own. If you want more of this kind of stuff, have a look at my subsequent CPD sessions that you can sign on to. But this is just a little illustration here of the flexibility of this new off-the-job and duration flexibility. To understand the types of employers that you've got might dictate how you can design some of your programs that actually, if you've got a high staff retention employer with low training time availability, you probably wouldn't have delivered to them before. You might be able to now. That might be an interesting angle with this, with the rush to enroll level 7s, that actually some of those programs could be longer because you wouldn't be worried that employee would not be there because the staff retention of that employer is good. So it's just something to think about. Yeah. So we used to have a rule on if a learner was working less than 30 hours, that there would be a mandatory extension to that practical training period based on a formula. That formula is now gone because of this flexibility of delivering the hours over whatever pattern that you want to, as long as it's at least 8 months. Providers are expected to set a realistic duration. Again, this is a rule for new starts. It's not going to apply to existing learners. So the key question for you as a provider when you do have a learner with part-time hours is, can I deliver to this learner based on their working frequency and the way in which I've designed that program? So, and that's probably the question you've been asking before anyway. So it's really, a decision for you to think, well, does it fit? So think about your program designs for your part-time offers and whether it fits. But again, that flexibility of delivery allows that program to be far fewer hours per week, as long as they've done those minimum hours. Back to off-the-job and RPL calculations, because we have this change in hours, we have some changes to this process. The current rule for funding adjustments for prior learning is to take your original planned hours of program, understand the hours of prior learning, establish that as a percentage of content adjustment, and then your funding reduction to band was half of that percentage. So if you had 400 hours in your program, 100 hours of prior learning, that's a 25% content reduction. The funding reduction would have been half of that, 12.5%. If your program had a 50% content reduction, your funding adjustment would be 25%, again, half of that. And after recognition of prior learning, an apprentice would need to have had at least 278 hours of need in order to be eligible to be an apprentice. But of course, that number is now 187. So just so that's clear that the 187 is now the minimum. The rest of the slide, we're just in conversation with the department at the moment, just for clarity. But we believe that using that extract in the funding rules there, that if your curriculum was more than the minimum, in terms of the published minimum for hours, and you've got a few more hours in your curriculum there, that actually your calculation would be based on that higher number. It's still the 50% of content adjustment rule. So you can see I've worked through that in this example on screen here. Example 1, 400 hours published for the standard, 100 hours of prior learning, 25% content reduction equals 12.5% reduction to band. That learner, if they completed early, only needs to do 300 hours because it's 400 hours minus the 100 hours of prior learning. In example 2, the provider has more hours than the published minimum in their curriculum. So they have 500 hours. 100 hours of prior learning in that model equals a 20% content reduction equals a 10% reduction to band. So it will reward providers to have more hours in their program, but bear in mind, learners need to do, are going to need to do a lot of hours, but the minimum that learner would need to do if they completed early is the published number minus the hours of prior learning. So actually in this example, those learners would, both of those learners would only require 300 hours of off-the-job in their evidence. So key angle in this one is make sure you're validating your program design, you're clear on what your hours are. So it kind of links to that earlier one about comparing your curriculum hours to the minimum. Good providers are going to strengthen their validation processes and their translation of skills analysis. And you're going to want to ensure your training plan has a field of your planned hours and a field of those minimum hours if that learner is a faster learner through those objectives. Martin will talk to you a little bit about that in due course. But the key change is that floor for eligibility is 187 rather than 278. This has drastically changed the potential for many learners to be an apprentice. And with that provider-friendly funding formula for RPL, you could have in some cases a standard where you've got 80% content adjustment and that learner's still eligible and it's only a 40% reduction in price. So there's some opportunities there for providers, particularly in some higher level programs. But again, you've got to think quality first and foremost. What does that program look like? Is that a realistically beneficial in program for that employer? Would that employer want to pay that for that program? Maybe we see some of those programs, but with lower prices than the maximum that could be funded in those programs. So some things to think about there. As I said, all of those things also change that minimum number a learner would need to do if they completed early. In 24-25, the minimum if you wanted to complete early is 278 hours or their original planned hours of program, or the minimum hours that they need to have done based on the practical period that they've completed at the point they're ready for EPA. So if they had a 2-year program but were ready at 18 months, as long as they've done the minimum off the job at 18 months, they'd be eligible to go to EPA. 25-26 rules, as I said, has been confirmed. It's the standards published minimum hours minus the hours of prior learning, and it's been at least 8 months. That's the key thing. So 8-month practical periods, 9-month completions are absolutely going to be possible. For those of you thinking big picture, if you've got some standards that can be delivered in a shorter space of time, maybe some level 2 standards, maybe some level 3 programs with prior learning, or any program with prior learning, you might be able to have learners that start in 25-26 and complete in 25-26, improving your QAR position if you so wish. So there's some interesting angles on that. So actions here: ensure you've got good controls at the point of gateway to ensure that your learners are hitting those revised minimums. Again, Martin and Angela will talk about that in a bit in terms of solutions that Aptem are putting in place for this. Those of you that would like to come on a deeper dive session with me, details will be at the end of this session, but we're going to apply a little bit more detail in there. One of the other silly changes that is kind of, whether it's beneficial or not, I'm not sure. If a learner had achieved with less off-the-job hours than originally planned and before their expected planned end date, in 24-25 and before, we needed a statement of satisfaction from the employer that they were still satisfied with that volume of delivery. We don't need it anymore in 25-26. However, my advice is it's a good process to have because you're looking at establishing the customer experience and whether that employer is satisfied with your delivery. So you don't have to do it funding rules, but my advice is still probably worth doing. Maths and English functional skills. We had some key changes in this area in February, where of course someone aged 19 or over at the point of start did not have to achieve the relevant functional skills for that apprenticeship standard, and it was employer or apprentice choice, and we had to go through this activity of identifying if our existing learners wanted to carry on, and our new learners, it's a choice. Well, for 25-26, the department has confirmed that the employer has the key say here. The employer has the overall responsibility, which is going to mean that some learners quite fancied doing it, but the employer says no. And you're also going to have some scenarios where the employer says yes and the apprentice doesn't really fancy doing it. The reality here is that you're going to have some increased risks here, because there's a setting of expectation. What is my entitlement? What could I have? What could I do? Do I need those? Most good providers have figured out that in their standards, if their career development needs those quals, that they're insisting on those quals, but ultimately the employer has the key say. This is more of an Ofsted risk area, but my advice to a provider is to think about the difficult conversations if the apprentice and employer disagree about who's got, whether they're going to do it or not. Who has those conversations to manage service recovery? So top tip, establish your policy, improve those declarations in your training plans to make sure everyone was clear of their entitlements when they made that decision. That's my best advice really, is set the expectation, make it clear what their entitlements are after the program, during the program, so that when we are signing to say I don't want to do them or I do want to do them, everyone's clear. And just a little word of warning, to think about those learners that you did close down functional skills for earlier this year. They're going to hit your retention rates for this year because they'll count as non-achieved aims. Just be aware of that when you're looking at your data. One of the key changes for this year is to ensure if you are funding any maths and English functional skill, you've got evidence of the plan of delivery of those aims and evidence of those things happening, that you've got evidence of active learning in maths and English when you're funding maths and English. So this is potentially going to increase the need for providers to document their maths and English activity. Now, whether that's done through software or whether that's done through a hours log, that's going to be up to you to decide. You are going to be able to liaise with your software suppliers. So those are the extracts from the rules there, just basically saying we've got to have evidence of active learning. It uses the example of if I've planned for that to be months 1, 3, and 5, that's what I need to have evidence of. Your training plans as providers don't tend to have great clarity on how that maths English program is going to be delivered. You are going to need that, but you're also going to need evidence of it occurring and some assurance that it's occurring. So in terms of whether you've got off the job logs and you can record those other types of hours, that might be one way of doing it, but you might have evidence from other platforms or learning activities that show those maths English are occurring, but you are going to need that evidence of those maths English aims occurring if you are funding them. An important clarification for additional payments rules linked to the shorter duration minimum duration rule. Because some apprenticeships can now just be 8 months of practical training period, followed by EPA or assessment. We used to have the second payment of the £500 for provider, £500 for an employer if that apprentice was 16 to 18-year-old. That second payment was paid at 365 days. There's an important clarification here, which is because of a reduction to that minimum duration, if you've set your program to be less than 12 months, i.e. at start we've set that to be less than 12 months, the second £500 is generated at 242 days. But importantly, if you set your program to be longer than 12 months and the apprentice achieves earlier, probably you didn't recognize the prior learning, you won't get the second payment and the employer won't get the second payment. So that's worth clarifying with the department because it does seem a little draconian, but that's the way it's written in the rules at the moment. So that's something, again, you need to be conscious of. That's not saying set your programs to be more than 12 months and make sure it is 12 months, although some providers might end up doing that. The reality is this is about linked to good initial assessment, understanding whether a learner needs that time or not. But just be clear with employers that actually if it's less than 12 months, there's not, if we don't plan it to be less than 12 months, they won't get that additional payment. So ensure those terms are clear in the terms and conditions that your employers are signing that are in your agreements, because otherwise you might be contractually agreeing to pay out that money when actually the department's not going to pay you it. So again, my advice is just clarify with the help centre the terms on that second payment. Running out of time a little bit, but we're getting along the key things now. So another key thing that actually all providers have been required to do, but was never in funding rules, was there's a statutory duty to report any apprentice aged 16 to 17 that was at risk of becoming not in education or training. Apprenticeships count as meeting that requirement. And if that learner was going to be made unemployed or redundant or left their employer, you're supposed to have informed your local authority. And that is now added in the funding rules as a thing you must do. Again, whether if you did or didn't do this, the department might say, oh, we're going to take money off you. I don't think they would. But this is certainly something linked to inclusion strategies and likely an Ofsted risk if you're not informing your local authorities of this, of a learner becoming at risk of losing their position. For those of you working in wider geography, that's going to be more challenging because you're going to need to know the local authority officers to contact, or the contact details of your relevant local authority. But my advice is ensure you've got responsibility and accountability within your organization for this area, and think about that, how you flag disengagement from a program, whether you're able to flag disengaging learners that are 16 to 17 to preempt this area. Again, there's an opportunity there to really strengthen quality by understanding that your 16 to 17-year-olds are the learners that are most vulnerable. Therefore, if we identify their disengagement first and foremost, and we can inform the local authorities, then we are really, really working to improve our inclusion strategies there. We have a lot of rules on the new Foundation Apprenticeship Programme. It probably should have had its own funding rules document, but you can't have everything. This is a new level 2 product with programs designed to be at least 8 months and 187 hours. There are several foundation apprenticeships that were published on the IFATE website. Those will probably move across to the Skills England website in due course. But you can see the standards there on the left-hand side. Eligibility for these is for individuals aged between 16 and 21, or 22 or 16 to 24 if they've got an EHCP. Or were aged between 22 and 24 and is either a prisoner or a prison leaver. Those learners, the foundation apprenticeship needs to be the most suitable pathway for them. All the other apprenticeship rules apply. They need to be employed. They need to have a training plan, apprenticeship agreement, all those things, and clarity of what is in that program. Additional payments will also apply. The funding rates for these aims are not huge. And my advice to a provider is to really think about the client group and whether you are capable of delivering to that client group. Learners on traineeships, for example, and previous programs to that, they can be incredibly successful and worthwhile programs, but they do require a lot of resource to support that client group, increased intensity and so on and so forth. There's some other specific rules to this program. Starts are only possible once an EPAO has obtained Ofqual recognition for that standard. Again, keep an eye out on the assessment plans for that standard. I think if you deliver in these areas, in level 2 and level 3 programs currently, there might be a fit here. But again, think about, I said, whether you have the capability to deliver in these areas. There's an example of the apprenticeship details page from IFATE for the foundation apprenticeships. It talks about the client group here. This one was the finishing trades foundation apprenticeship, £4,000 maximum funding, and there's an additional employer incentive in that standard. Some of them do have additional incentives for employers. So they're not to be dismissed, worth having a look at. Consider your resources necessary to develop an effective product here. Think about the client group and think about the support that you can put to that program and what that program's delivery might look like. I think top piece of advice I can give here is, if you are going to have a program here, design it in such a way as it creates for you prior learning for your subsequent apprenticeship opportunities. And then when those apprenticeships come along, you can apply, shorter programs, make a funding reduction, yes, but remember, it's only 50% of the content adjustment that you're making. So it is far more worthwhile to have RPL because you'll get learner through the program quicker, and it's a higher rate per hour if you do the maths. At the same time, foundation apprenticeships, they're going to develop. There'll be more in subsequent versions of the funding rules. Think about how you establish those payment terms with employers, how you market to those employers, and what that training plan might look like. That actually it might need to be a little bit more granular than other programs, and really think about what it might look like. Care leave bursary, a couple of clarifications. Clarification that it's tax-free and not treated as income, and that we're supposed to make sure the applicant is informed about it. My top advice for you is in your application process, or in certainly within the AppTem onboarding function, that you make those learners, those applicants, aware of the presence of this bursary and the benefits of disclosure, the fact they can get that money and this is what it looks like. Again, the benefits of disclosure are something that, again, you might also want to think about in terms of learning support. So a couple of simple actions here is make sure you're clarifying the availability of the care leaver bursary. Prisoner apprenticeships in 24-25, a prisoner could not take EPA prior to release. For a start in 25-26, they can. My advice, if you're delivering prisoner apprenticeships, is perhaps liaise with the department and just get clarification as to whether they might be able to do that for the live learner as well as the new start. But rules are pretty clear that it's new starts, but never know, don't ask, don't get. So think about that and contact the department help center. Privacy notice, we have a new one. Martin and team will make sure that that is in your new onboarding process for enrollments that are due to take place from the 1st of August. So to change that, not a great deal of work change really, it's just changing the ESFA for Department for Education and a few other updates. There might be some updates there based on I-FATE moving to Skills England as well, so it's possible there might be a new version of the privacy notice before August. A couple of clarifications in the eligibility sections. Most important one really is that an EEA and Swiss national is confirmed to have been they're eligible to be here and do not and their pre-settled status or settled status doesn't expire even if they've not made further application. So basically the rule requiring an individual to have sufficient time remaining to them. If you had settled status and it expired in a year and you've got a 2-year program and that person was an EEA national, they would be eligible in 25-26 because their settlement status would not expire. Now that is only for EEA and Swiss nationals in that area. There's some other minor granular changes in the eligibility section. My advice is have a little have a look at that, and of course naturally your eligibility criteria will want to be updated as a result. Again, in my deeper dive session that I'll talk about in a bit, we'll go into some of those in a little bit more depth. So think about updating your eligibility documentation. Think about actually whether this might change your approach to client groups and the liaison you might have with employers around the eligibility of some individuals. But yeah, it's a good area. So that was quite whistle stop. That was quite quick through some of those things. I've not touched upon some other areas of limited change. We talked about active learning in maths and English. For eligibility, a person can't be a person of significant control with no identifiable line manager. But we pretty much covered all the other key things. There's some minor changes with subcontracting in terms of you've got to just make sure you're aware of the funding high-risk organizations and subcontractors policy when you are subcontracting to those organizations where they're going to receive less than £100,000 and they're not on APAR. If you're doing initial teacher training and you're subcontracting that, there's some flexibility there that, again, in organizations that's not on APAR could be subcontracted to. But again, there's a total funds restriction for that organization. So some little bits there. So I think the key messages really is that these 25-26 rule changes on duration and hours and delivery flexibility represent the most significant changes to apprenticeship compliance and funding since 2017. That shift to that 8-month minimum duration of practical period and the standardization of minimum OTJs and that change in assessment methodology and the distribution of that program, it gives a real floor to delivery models. It allows provider flexibility to design some innovative models. But again, make sure you think quality first and foremost. Make sure you think of the big picture. Short-term wins in terms of shortening durations will mean nothing if you're going to cause yourself accountability framework issues with past planned end date, withdrawals, and so on and so forth. So really work with your employers to understand what will work. You're going to want to look at the funding rules in a little bit more depth. You're going to want to think about the changes you're going to make. Who are the people in charge of those areas where you're making changes? Certainly there's some development in business development here. There's some changes in program design, most likely. But we need to think that there will be some other updates. A version 2 of rules will come out. A few people have asked, when is that? It will be probably before the 1st of August, but I couldn't tell you exactly when. Obviously, the department's got a few changes and updates they're making based on feedback from the sector, but there will be a version 2 in due course. But work from version 1 for now. I think there's a lot to think about. I'm going to be delivering a deeper dive 3-hour version of this session where we're going to include a changes action plan. Aptem customers will get a discount on that session, but it is something I would recommend. This is the details for it here. Go to the Strategic Development Network.co.uk website or look up SDN events and go to the funding rules session. If you're an Aptem customer, you can use the code APTEM20 at checkout for a discount on that session. But it's a further deep dive. We're going to issue a changes action plan and some other useful tools for you. But if you don't, and I'm not going to hold it against you if you don't, key actions in the short term is form a change team. I assign some leadership and accountability to it. Prioritize your key areas that are important to your organization and go through the funding rules in those core areas, and also pick out those other areas. The summary of changes document will give you some other little areas to look at, so work through those and understand where you are. Use the official rules though when you're really planning out your change, and I've said here, lean on software suppliers to address known issues. Well, I can tell you for one that Aptem are already being proactive in these areas. Strategic focus, I think it's a great year for good providers who understand their delivery hours and align their models with employer need and understand that employer makeup. There's some good opportunities for some optimal programs there. Not great for providers of delivering level 7, naturally, but also it's a bad year for weaker providers who don't have that clarity in their program hours, or those providers that had far less hours than those minimums. Well, you've got to understand, why did I have less hours than those minimums? Is it because we didn't understand the hours that actually are needed in our program? Or is it because we are going to have prior learning in our programs in future? So do think about that. Okay, with that in mind, let's pass over to the Aptem team, who will talk about some of the things that we've been doing and they've been doing to prepare their clients for these key changes.
Thank you, David. That was amazing to be so detailed and thorough and so useful. I hope everyone found lots of insights to take forward as they approach the new year. At Aptem, we really value, it's a top priority for us. We would prioritize compliance. Shortly after the rules released, we met as a compliance advisory board that David sits on, Angela sits on, and so do I, with amongst a few others. We went through the rules, we digested them, we looked at the rules that specifically would apply to Aptem and parts of the system that we would need to make changes to. Key amongst those, as you can see, are obviously all the new minimums. So we will be rolling out new minimums for duration. We will be integrating the published minimums for each standard into the system, and then obviously applying RPEL to those in the system so that our customers can understand what the minimum hours they need to deliver are for those quicker learners if they are planning that sort of way. We'll also be removing any links between working hours and everything else, so it will just be the standard, straightforward minimums. We will also be looking at strengthening the way that our customers can log English and maths hours and plan those activities to meet the updated active learning rules around functional skills. And we will be making changes to our training plan template, which is one of the compliance documents that's automatically generated as part of onboarding, and obviously at any other point when the training plan needs to be generated. First of all, in our June release, and then upcoming before the August changes in July. We will then be looking at other changes and things that we can strengthen within the system, as always, to offer strengthening compliance features for our customers to help them remain compliant. But I see that there are quite a lot of questions, so I think it's probably best that we move on and go through some questions. Angela, have you picked out a top question for David?
We have. As we've said, there's a lot of questions. Sorry, Martin. There are a lot of questions that's coming through, but I think the main theme at the moment is around applying RPL. So, David, if you can clarify a little bit more on the difference between the published minimum hours, the planned hours if they are higher than the published minimum, how you would apply RPL, and in relation to the 187 hours as well.
Yeah, okay, so difficult without the graphic, I suppose. But so this is something we took back to the department and gave a couple of models and got clarification from. So if you've got the minimum hours for your standard, then that's your curriculum, and you identify prior learning hours, then your new floor for that learner when they achieve is the minimum hours minus the hours of prior learning. And like I said, with a floor of 187. So as long as if that learner needed 190, then that learner's only going to need to do 190 hours. If you identify that there was no prior learning and your program is 290 hours, then the learner is going to have to do 290 hours. So you can see that places real emphasis on how good your initial assessment is. Otherwise, you're going to have learners doing a lot of pointless hours, and it could be queried as to whether they're necessary, and you could potentially have an eligibility risk. If your hours are more than the minimum, then you are identifying the prior learning hours against that curriculum. The minimum that apprentice has to do is the minimum volume for that standard minus those prior learning hours. So that could lead to some quite significant distortions, but again, you've got this minimum need of 187 hours that you must always make sure the learner needs that, and if they don't need 187 hours, then they're not going to be eligible to be an apprentice. Expect some more clarity on that in future versions. We're going to be in touch to clarify our own calculators on this. I would think it's possible that when they update their training plan template, the department might include some calculator within that, but we don't know at the moment. That training plan's not been updated. And in terms of what Aptem can do in here, I'm sure we'll be working to let them know what we hear from the department directly, and we'll be able to work something in there, I'm sure. But it's a bit of an unknown. We've got a few months to get clarity. If you are unsure, you can always ask the help center and get clarity there, but I think you'll see the same response we got. We posted a couple of examples and we got that clarity of, if you've got more hours in your program, then your calculation of prior learning starts with that higher number. The bit that you're it's the provider can have higher value hours if they want.
Thanks for that, David. In relation to that, Martin, is there any chance you could just expand a little bit on how the funding calculations will be recorded in Aptem?
Absolutely, thank you, Angela. We plan, once we have a sort of much firmer idea about how that calculation will work, potentially to bring it into the program application stage so that we can, RPL everything else going on at that point. So we could offer the calculation at that point and as well as other different points within our process automation trackers and things that we've got that can be used to sort of make adjustments later on in the program. App10 customers, it should say, thinking of these upcoming developments, will be kept up to date. They should be receiving an email shortly this week, pointing them to a new part of our App10 Help Centre, which is the 2025-26 Funding Rules Hub, where they can keep up to date with everything. Every single time we move a new feature in to any stage during development, we'll be keeping that up to date so our customers know what's happening and when it will happen as well.
Thanks for that, Martin.
No worries,
and I
thanks.
think that's us finished for now. Thanks everybody for attending today.
Thank you, David, Martin and Angela. We're sure everyone in attendance has found that this webinar incredibly useful. As we approach the end of the session, we invite you to visit our website if you wish to catch up on any of our industry webinars on demand. The link is in the chat now. Looking ahead to our next webinars, here's what's coming up. On Tuesday, the 17th of June, we're running a thought leadership webinar on the role of AI in addressing the challenges in the apprenticeship sector. On Tuesday, 26th of June, we'll be running a briefing for Aptum customers, practical Aptum tips to keep UR14 ready. On Tuesday, the 8th of July, we are running a quarterly roadmap webinar where we walk you through the latest exciting Aptum updates and share plans for upcoming releases. And lastly, on Thursday, the 10th of July, we are running another thought leadership webinar. How do training providers continue to improve their qualification achievement rate? Thank you once again to David, to Martin and Angela for your help with questions, and to you all for joining today. Hope you all have a great week ahead. Thank you and goodbye.